Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Now, recently I checked out AMD's new Ryzen 7 5700G and Ryzen 5 5600G APUs featuring integrated Vega graphics, and the hope was that perhaps these new APUs would present as an ideal stopgap for PC gamers holding out for better graphics card pricing. Today's video sponsor is Be Quiet and their brand new Silent Loop 2. Designed as a high-performance, whisper-quiet all-in-one liquid cooler for overclockers, it features a dampened 6-pole pump, Silent Wings 3 PWM high-speed fans, and is available in a range of formats featuring 360, 280, 240, and 120mm radiators. Now, although Be Quiet has focused on thermal and noise performance, the Silent Loop 2 is still a very eye-catching liquid cooler thanks to some strategically placed ARGB LEDs that deliver some amazing looking effects. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. The 5700G didn't really make sense with its rather high $360 US price tag, and I really felt that AMD needed to slash about $100 off the asking price for me to even consider it. Although it packs 8 cores with 16 threads, it only comes with half the L3 cache of the fully fledged Zen 3 parts, such as the Ryzen 7 5800X for example, and that means that the 5700G was much slower for CPU related tasks, including gaming with a discrete GPU. The more affordable $260 Ryzen 5 5600G made a lot more sense, though again I felt it was a bit overpriced and really should have been positioned much closer to $200 US. But I could at least imagine a few scenarios where the 5600G would be a viable option. Now, what a lot of budget-conscious PC gamers were hoping for was a repeat of the Ryzen 3 3300X, but with integrated graphics for around $160 US. Basically, a Ryzen 3400G replacement. But sadly, we never got it. Well, sort of. The Ryzen 3 5300G is actually a thing, and it's a 4-core 8-thread processor featuring 6CU integrated Vega graphics. The only problem is, you can't really buy it, or at least not without all the bits that actually make it work. You see, the 5300G is an OEM-only part, but unlike the 5600G and 5700G, which spent the first 4 months of existence in OEM-only status before being released into the retail channel, the 5300G is set to be an OEM exclusive. The reason for this is likely down to supply, as AMD wants to avoid a repeat of the Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X. Basically, in order to make a 5300G, AMD is using defective silicon that couldn't be binned for use as a 5600G, and this is because the Ryzen 3 model only requires 4 working cores, 8MB of L3 cache, and 6 CUs. So the 5300G, as I see it, serves 2 main purposes. It allows AMD to convert their defective silicon into cache, while also allowing them to service the OEM market with budget-friendly Ryzen parts that don't require a discrete graphics card. Because of this, AMD is not interested in releasing a retail version of the 5300G, as in order to meet the inevitable demand, they'd have to start selling working silicon that could be used for the 5600G and possibly even the 5700G, and that silicon they could make a lot more money from if they were to sell it with those higher end parts. This is the very reason why the Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X disappeared from shelves so quickly. AMD wasn't willing to use working silicon destined for use as a Ryzen 5 3600 or Ryzen 7 3700X to ensure a constant supply of those cheap Ryzen 3 parts, so instead they were out of stock for much of their life. Now, unlike the Ryzen 3 3100 and 3300X, the 5300G isn't a cut-down version of the original Zen 3 parts, but rather it's a monolithic die. So it's a Cezanne part and therefore is a cut-down version of the 5600G and 5700G. As I've already noted, it has just 4 cores with SMT support for 8 threads, but another big change has been made to the L3 cache capacity, which has been reduced to just 8MB, half that of the 5600G and 5700G. And those parts feature half the L3 cache of the mainstream Ryzen 5000 series CPUs. So a big drop in L3 cache capacity there, and that is no doubt going to have a negative impact on performance. Though as we recently discovered, with just 4 cores active you can get away with a smaller L3 cache, as there simply aren't enough cores to take advantage of a larger buffer. As for clock specifications, the 5300G boosts to 4.2 GHz with a base frequency of 4 GHz, and that means the max boost is 200 MHz lower than that of the 5600G and 400 MHz lower than the 5700G. Now, we know that there won't be a retail version of the Ryzen 3 5300G, but if you have the chance to purchase an OEM chip, or are looking at a system using it, how well does it actually perform? To find out, we need to get into the benchmarks, and for this I've split the testing up into 3 sections. Firstly, we're going to look exclusively at CPU performance by testing the 5300G in applications with an RTX 2080 Ti, so I can compare it with the rest of our CPU data. Then I want to see how well it works with the Vega iGPU, and for this I'll be comparing it to a number of other iGPU solutions, as well as a few configurations featuring entry-level graphics cards. Then finally, I've also run quite a lot of discrete GPU tests using the GeForce RTX 3090, allowing us to compare the 5300G to a range of other CPUs with a very powerful graphics card. So that should be interesting, and it will give us a good idea of what kind of headroom this APU offers gamers should they upgrade down the track. So let's get into it. Starting with Cinebench, we see that the 5300G's multi-core performance is roughly equivalent to that of the 6-core 12-thread Ryzen 5 2600, so not bad for a quad-core processor. It's also not a great deal slower than the Core i5-10400F here, trailing by a 15% margin. So while the performance isn't amazing, if this were a $106 US APU, I think the result would be considered rather good. And the reason for the stronger than expected multi-core result when compared to parts like the R5 2600 and i5-10400F is due to the strong single-core performance. The 5300G scored 522 points, and that means for single-core performance in this workload, it's just 4% slower than the Core i5-11400F, so a mighty impressive result there. The 7-zip compression performance is weaker than what we saw in Cinebench. Here the 5300G trailed the R5 2600 by a 10% margin, and the i5-10400F by a 19% margin. That said, it was a massive 85% faster than the Ryzen 5 3400G, so quite an extreme upgrade there. The 5300G falls further behind the R5 2600 for decompression work, this time trailing by an 18% margin, though it was now just 9% slower than the i5-10400F. Then when compared to the 3400G, we see that the margin has been significantly reduced, but even so the 5300G was still a good bit faster, offering 29% greater performance. The Ryzen 3 5300G is able to lean on its strong single-core performance in Adobe After Effects, matching what are typically much faster CPUs such as the Ryzen 7 3700X and Core i7-10700K. When compared to the 3400G, the new 5300G was 26% faster, so another strong performance uplifter there. And we're seeing a similar thing with Photoshop, which really only heavily utilizes 1 to 2 cores, and this plays to the 5300G's advantage, allowing it to match what are typically much faster CPUs, such as the 3700X, 10600K, and R5 3600. Adobe Premiere Pro, on the other hand, does tend to use a lot more of the CPU, and as a result the 5300G is located right towards the bottom of our graph with a score of just 561 points. Surprisingly, this meant the 5300G wasn't really any faster than the 3400G in this test. And then last up for the application benchmarks, we have Blender, and here the 5300G was 22% faster than the 3400G. That said, it was 16% slower than the R5 2600 and almost 40% slower than its bigger brother, the R5 5600G. An advantage of the 5300G when compared to the more powerful 5600G is the fact that it sips power. Here we're looking at a total system consumption of just 111 watts when using the Radeon RTX 2080 Ti, so basically the same level of power as using a 3400G, but with over 20% better performance in this test. Moving on to the iGPU testing, we'll start with Assassin's Creed Valhalla using the lowest possible quality settings at 1080p. Here the stock 5300G was good for just 26 FPS on average, which is basically the same level of performance delivered by the old 3400G. That said, with the iGPU overclocked to 2.4 GHz, we were able to match the stock 5600G with 31 FPS, so a decent improvement there. The 5300G was slightly faster than the 3400G in Rainbow Six Siege, rendering 52 FPS on average, so an 11% improvement. Overclocking did boost performance by a further 17%, allowing for 61 FPS on average, and that's slightly better than a stock 5600G. We see that Horizon Zero Dawn is a bit of a struggle at 1080p, and for playable performance you'd really want to drop the resolution down, probably as low as 720p. Again, overclocking did boost performance by 17%, and although not terribly useful at 1080p, at lower resolutions this gain could come in very handy. The overclock does result in a very big 32% performance uplift in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and that makes a real difference to how well the game plays, going from a very laggy 28 FPS on average to a much smoother 37 FPS. Impressively, this saw the 5300G go from only matching the 3400G to mimicking the performance of the 5700G. Moving on, we have Doom Eternal, and here the 5300G was good for 40 FPS, which is a solid out-of-the-box experience, and once overclocked I was able to push it up to 47 FPS on average, so an 18% improvement there. Watch Dogs Legion is another game like Assassin's Creed Valhalla or Horizon Zero Dawn that'll really need to be played at 720p if you want to avoid a slideshow-like experience. Stock the 5300G was good for just 23 FPS, and then when overclocked to the max it only provided 28 FPS, so less than ideal to say the least. As you'd expect, Counter-Strike Global Offensive plays very well using the medium quality preset at 1080p, and despite offering just 7% greater performance when compared to the older Ryzen 5 3400G, the Ryzen 3 5300G was good for 89 FPS, so a great gaming experience there. The second last game test is F1 2020, and it is possible to achieve playable performance out of the box with the 5300G, rendering 46 FPS on average. That said, it's also possible to boost performance by a further 20%, pumping at 55 FPS, and at this point the 5300G is enabling quite an enjoyable gaming experience. For the last iGPU benchmark, we have Dota 2, and this game runs really very well on the 5300G, though we're only talking about an 11% boost over the 3400G. Meanwhile, the overclock did improve performance by a further 15%, hitting 70 FPS on average, and that's about what the Radeon RX 550 delivers in this title. Okay, so here's how the Ryzen 3 5300G performs when paired with the GeForce RTX 3090, and granted, no one is going to do that, at least not anytime soon, but the idea is to show CPU limited gaming performance, so if you were to buy a more powerful graphics card in a few years' time, this is how the 5300G would perform relative to other parts under CPU limited gaming conditions. The F1 2020 performance certainly isn't bad, with roughly 200 FPS on average and a 1% low of 160 FPS, almost twice that of the 3400G, so a massive upgrade there. The 5300G also beat the R5 2600 quite convincingly and wasn't a great deal slower than the R5 3600, so I'd say overall quite a good result there. Next up we have Rainbow Six Siege, and here the 5300G just edged ahead of the R5 2600, and that made it one of the slowest CPUs tested, and by some margin. Although it was a massive 42% faster than the 3400G, it was also 27% slower than the 5600G and 18% slower than the R5 3600. Still, overall, plenty of frames were being pushed out here, despite the fact that the 5300G was much slower than modern 6-core 12-thread parts. Moving on to Horizon Zero Dawn, which isn't a very CPU-demanding title, at least by today's standards, we see that the 5300G is able to match the R5 3600 this time, allowing it to outpace the 3400G by a whopping 36% margin. It was also just 12% slower than the Ryzen 5 5600G, so one of the better results for this new quad-core APU. The 5300G does appear to do quite well in Borderlands 3 when looking at the average frame rate. However, if we do turn our attention to the 1% low performance, you'll see that it's significantly slower than the R5 2600 and really everything but the 3400G. We're only talking about a 13% improvement in 1% low performance from the 3400G, making the 5300G 35% slower than the 5600G. Performance in Watch Dogs Legion is more of the same really. The 5300G was only able to match the R5 2600, and while that meant it was still 50% faster than the 3400G when comparing 1% low performance, it was also 27% slower than the 5600G. Quite interestingly, the Ryzen 5 3400G completely tanked in Death Stranding, dropping down as low as 41 FPS for the 1% low result. And that meant that the 5300G was over 2.5 times faster, again matching the Ryzen 5 2600, though it was a little over 20% slower than the 5600G. The 5300G did struggle relative to the 6-core 12-thread processors in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, trailing the R5 2600 by a 9% margin, and only beating the 3400G by 12%. Then, when compared to the Ryzen 5 5600G, we're looking at a 30% drop in performance. Finally, we have Hitman 2, and here the 5300G was able to edge just ahead of the R5 2600, allowing for 104 FPS on average, making it 15% slower than the 5600G. Still, when compared to the old 3400G, we're looking at a massive 65% increase in performance. Here's a look at the average performance seen across the 10 games tested, and as you can see, the 5300G was similar to the Ryzen 5 2600, making it 12% slower than the R5 3600 and almost 20% slower than the 5600G. Still, when compared to AMD's last retail quad-core APU, we're looking at a 45% performance improvement on average. So there you have it, the Ryzen 3 5300G. It's not exactly going to blow your socks off, but of course that was never the intention or expectation. And when compared to the Ryzen 5 3400G, which was based on the second generation Zen Plus architecture, the 5300G is a huge upgrade, at least on the CPU side, thanks to those Zen 3 cores. I feel the Ryzen 3 5300G would be a great CPU for entry-level gamers because despite only offering 4 cores with SMT support, performance was generally quite good and significantly better than older quad cores such as the 3400G. There were still some instances where the frame time performance wasn't great, but I feel entry-level gamers are going to be a lot more willing to live with that at the right price. Speaking of which, it is quite hard to award the 5300G a value rating given that it is an OEM-only product. If it were available at retail for between $150 to $170 US, so the same price range that the 3400G was introduced at, and that makes it about $100 less than the 5600G, then I think it would be a decent deal. Granted that the Core i3-10100F can often be had for just $110 US, but it is a slower CPU and the iGPU is basically useless for gaming, making the 5300G a much more well-rounded product. Unfortunately though, we will never get the opportunity to get excited over the 5300G, as you'll have to purchase it in an OEM system, and those typically aren't very good. The 2021 HP Pavilion that I purchased to get my 5300G is the same model I acquired to score an earlier review of the 5700G, and technically speaking, it's not great. Apart from the fact that you have to deal with proprietary motherboard power connectors and a custom PSU, the components themselves just aren't very good. The motherboard, for example, features a weak 5-phase VRM without any cooling, so expect a very limited upgrade path on that board. If you could buy the 5300G and slot it onto an entry-level B550 motherboard, that would make for a great combo with a decent upgrade path for either a more powerful CPU or a graphics card in the future, or I suppose both. Anyway, that is going to do it for this look at AMD's Ryzen 3 5300G. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to give it a like. You can also subscribe for more content. And if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, you can join us over at Floatplane or Patreon. Links for those in the video description. You get access to our exclusive Discord server where Tim and myself are active in there chatting with you guys. We also do a monthly live stream. So again, you can ask us questions there live and we'll answer those. And we have behind the scenes content, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff. So yeah, if you're interested, check it out. But if not, perfectly fine. And I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.